Good afternoon. Today we are combining topics 9-8 and topic 9-9, tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. And what we're going to be working on in this lesson is how we can change fractions to decimals and decimals to fractions. And as we've talked about this before, basically when you say a decimal, you hear a fraction. So this shouldn't be really hard. We're going to run into some fractions that don't sound like decimals, and I want to teach you how to change those fractions into decimals in an easy way. For now, look over here at the side where I have all my denominators or powers of 10. Obviously, if I have denominators that are powers of 10, I can read the fraction 4/10, and I can know that this is that 4/10 in decimal form. 368 thousandths, this would be 368 thousandths in decimal form. 16 hundredths, this would be 16 hundredths in decimal form. So as long as the denominators are powers of 10, it's very simple to change a fraction into a decimal. It's when you have fractions like this that your denominator is not a power of 10, you don't hear a decimal when you say it. So I want to show you today how you can convert that very quickly and easily to a decimal. Many fractions do not have a denominator of 10 or 100 or any multiple of 10 for that matter, but they can still be changed into decimals. How do you think that can happen? Let's take 2/5. How could you change 2/5 into a decimal? If you go back and think about what 2/5 is, it's a division problem. 2 divided by 5. So in order to change that into a decimal, you're going to actually work the division problem. So let's go ahead and make our house. And we have 2, and it's divided by 5. Okay? The first thing you need to do is remember that there's a decimal point at the end of every whole number. So the first thing you're going to do is add a decimal point and just go ahead and add a couple of zeros. Okay? So remember when you do decimal division, you just bring that baby up. And now let's just divide like normal. 5 does not go into 2, but 5 goes into 20 4 times. 4 times 5 is 20. Bring down your 0. 5 goes into 0 0 times. 0 times 5 is 0, and we can stop. You have just changed 2/5 into a decimal, which is 40 hundredths. Now remember that the zeros at the end of decimals do not have to be there. So if I were to cover this 0 up, that number would be 4/10. So let's look at a couple more. How can you write a fraction as a decimal? Here I wanted to show you that the powers of 10, it's very easy to see them. 3/10 is 3 10 rods. 9 100ths is 9 individual hundredth blocks. But then we run into 1/4. And 1/4 does not have a denominator that's a power of 10. So your job is going to be to look at it and say 1/4 is 1 divided by 4. We have our 1 and we divide it by 4. Go ahead and put your decimal and a couple of zeros after it. Bring that baby up. 4 doesn't go into 1, but 4 goes into 10 2 times. 2 times 4 is 8. Subtract. Bring down. 4 goes into 20 5 times. 5 times 4 is 20. We have just changed 1/4, the fraction 1/4, into a decimal, 25 hundredths, 0.25. So it's very simple. If your denominator is not a power of 10, you have to simply do the division. Write 3/5 as a decimal. You're dividing 3 divided by 5. Make your house. We have 3 divided by 5. Put your decimal and a couple of zeros. Bring that baby up. 5 doesn't go into 3, but 5 goes into 36 times. 6 times 5 is 30. Okay, bring down. 5 goes into 0 0 times. 0 times 5 is 0. Now notice, I just as a rule of thumb added 2 zeros. Notice that the answer they got here is 6/10. The answer I got here is 60 hundredths. Remember, those are the same thing. 6/10 is the same thing as 60 hundredths. Okay? So there are some fractions that I want to make sure that we just kind of know. This is something that, as a fifth grade student, when you see 1/4, you should automatically know that that's 0.25. Just like when you see 3/4, you should automatically know that that's 0.75. So I want you to, these are a couple that I do want you to memorize. 1/4 is a decimal is 2500ths. 3/4 is a decimal is 7500ths. 2/4 reduces to 1/2, and we know 1/2 would be 0.5 or 50/100ths, either one. So this page has 3 fractions that I really would like for you to memorize. 1/4 is 0.25, 2/4 is 0.5, 3/4 is 0.75. That makes it really easy as you're working with decimals and fractions. So let's try this one. Write 5/6 as a decimal. Well, my denominator is not a power of 10, so I'm going to have to divide it out just to see what it would be. 5 divided by 6, 5 divided by 6. Add your decimal point, couple of zeros. Bring that baby up. 6 doesn't go into 5, but 6 goes into 50 8 times. 8 times 6 is 48. Subtract, bring down. 6 goes into 20 3 times. 3 times 6 is 18. Still have a remainder, so let's add one more 0 and see what happens. 6 goes into 20 3 times. 3 times 6 is 18. I'm still going to end up with a 2. So we know that this is going to repeat. We call this a repeating decimal. So you can always round it to the hundredths place. So 5/6 as a decimal would be 0.83, or you could even draw the line over the top of the 3 that shows that that 3 is just going to keep repeating. We could keep adding zeros, and it would be the 3 would just continue. So on these 4, I'm going to say these decimals and these fractions, and I think you're going to hear what you need to be writing. So if it's a fraction, we're going to make it a decimal. If it's a decimal, we're going to make it a fraction. This reads 1/10 because it's a 1 in the tenths place. There's the fraction that says 1/10. This reads 200ths. There's a fraction that says 200ths. This is a fraction 9/10. I know as a decimal, that's what 9/10 looks like. This is a fraction 700ths, and I know this is 700ths as a decimal. So a lot of these you just have to think. If they're denominators or powers of 10, you're just asking yourself, what do I hear? How do I write that as the other? Now, on 5/11/20ths, we change that to a decimal. Let's show you another way you can do this. When I look at 11/20ths, I know that I could use equivalent fractions to make this into hundredths. And if I do that, my decimal is going to come very easily. So to get from 20 to 100, I would have to multiply times 5, which means I'm going to have to do the same thing to the denominator, times 5. 11 times 5 is 55. So I know 11/20ths as a decimal is 5500ths, and this is how it would look. Now, let me erase this because this does say to use division. So let's go ahead and do it that way as well. I just wanted to show you that really neat way of finding equivalent fractions with powers of 10 for your denominators. Okay, so 11 divided by 20 would look like this. 11 divided by 20. So let's add our decimal and a couple of zeros. Bring that baby up. 20 doesn't go into 11, but it does go into 110 5 times. 5 times 20 is 100. Subtract, bring down. 20 goes into 100 5 times. 5 times 20 is 100. And you see just as easily I got the same answer. 11/20ths as a fraction is 5500ths as a decimal. Okay, thousandths are basically the same thing. That's why I wanted to combine these two lessons. If you look at this big cube, this represents 1,000. And if I pulled 3 of them out, the number that I had pulled out as a fraction would be 3. Whoops, that looks like a question mark. Let's start over here. Would be 3 thousandths, so 3 over 1,000. As a decimal, it would be 0.003. Remember, tenths, hundredths, thousandths. If I just pulled 1 out, I would have pulled out 1,000th or 0.001. Tenths, hundredths, thousandths. So it's the same thing. You're listening. You're just listening for what you hear as a decimal and as a fraction. So let's write these decimals up here as fractions. When I say it out loud, this is 3 thousandths. This is how it's going to look. 3 thousandths. This is 50 thousandths. 50 thousandths. So I hope you're seeing that the more you listen to what you're saying, it tells you exactly what you need to write as long as it's a power of 10. Let's write these fractions as decimals. 211 thousandths would be 211. And we know we're in the right place because it's tenths, hundredths, thousandths. 90 thousandths would look like this. Decimal 0, 9, 0. Tenths, hundredths, thousandths. Okay? So this is just really a review of how we write decimals. Now, I do want to challenge you today as we think about moving further into our knowledge of fractions and decimals. How can I write 15 2/3 as a decimal? Now, don't freak out. Your 15 isn't going to change. 15 and I just need to figure out what this fraction 2/3 is as a decimal. So I'm going to say 2 divided by 3. Okay? So I'm going to draw my house. 2 divided by 3. Add my decimal and a couple of zeros. Bring that baby up. 3 doesn't go into 2, but it does go into 26 times. 3 times 6 is 18. Bring it down. 3 goes into 26 times. 6 times 3 is 18. Subtract, bring down. You notice there's a pattern here. It's going to continue with 6s. So if I were to go one more and then round it to the hundredths place. So I have 0.666 rounded to the hundredths place. Remember, I'm looking next door. 5 or more, give it a score. 4 or less, give it a rest. Because that is 5 or more, this 6 is going to turn into a 7. So this would be, rounded to the nearest hundredths place would be 0.67. So 15 2/3 would be 15 67 hundredths. Okay, remember we always round to the hundredths place if our numbers continue on. So not as hard as it looks. Just know that your whole number is not going to change. Remember your and tells you that you're going to have a decimal afterwards, a decimal or a portion of a whole. Figure out what 2/3 equals and then just add that to the 15. 15 2/3 is the same thing as 15 67 hundredths. Okay, time for you to do some work. On part 1 of your notes, how would you write 4/5 as a decimal? So what I'd like to see on your notes is 4/5 equals. Show me your work, show me how you did it, and then tell me what it equals as a decimal. Part 2 says, how would you write 2 6/1000ths as a fraction? I'm going to write it as a decimal for you. 2 6/1000ths, there it is as a decimal. I want you to write it as a fraction for me for part 2. That's a very simple one. And then part 3 kind of goes along with our challenge. How would you write 3 4/6 as a decimal? Remember, the 3 is your whole number. So you're obviously going to start with the 3, then your decimal point. Figure out what 4/6 equals as a decimal and just add it to your 3. Now, simplifying this 4/6 first might be the easiest way for you to go and figure out what this is as a decimal. So remember, if you ever are stuck, you don't remember, you don't understand, please go back and flip through different examples of the video so that you can come to class really with a good understanding and ready to work and ask me any questions that you have over the lesson. All right, have a good evening.